The town of Fair Creek always looked peaceful from the outside. It was the kind of place with white picket fences, clean sidewalks, and neighbors who waved from their porches with fake smiles hiding real opinions. But for Marcus Washington, that peace had always been a thin veil stretched over quiet hostility. He had lived there his entire life with his mother, Evelyn, his rock, his shelter, his everything. Their home stood at the far edge of the town, just before the pine woods began, a small, weathered house, paint peeling at the edges, but filled with warmth. Evelyn worked 2 jobs, yet always managed to keep food on the table, books on Marcus's shelf, and love in the air. To Marcus, she was more than a mother, she was a force, a woman who had endured more than most, though he never knew how much. But even in their tiny home, in that tiny town, racism slithered in like smoke under the door. Sometimes it was subtle, the old women who clutched their purses tighter when he walked by, the teachers who accidentally gave him lower grades, the shopkeepers who followed him with their eyes like he was a threat. Other times, it was louder, the slurs yelled from passing trucks, the police who pulled him over for no reason, the cold shoulders from classmates. Marcus had learned to swallow it all, quietly, patiently. His mother had taught him to stay calm, to keep his head down, to outwork, outthink, and outlast. But some storms don't ask for permission. Some storms come no matter how well you hide. That evening, the air was still. The sky was painted in strokes of orange and violet as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. Evelyn was humming softly in the kitchen, preparing dinner, a pot of collard greens and cornbread, Marcus's favorite. He was sitting at the dining table, head bent over a worn notebook, sketching quietly. Neither of them knew that this would be the last peaceful night they'd ever have. Marcus had always sensed that his mother was different from other mothers. It wasn't just the way she carried herself, with an unshakable confidence, or the way she handled adversity with grace and poise. It was the look in her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching, a haunted look, one that flashed only for a second before she masked it with her familiar warm smile. She never spoke of her past, and Marcus never pushed. After all, he had his own battles to face. He had his own struggles to deal with, the weight of being a young black man in a town where your skin color was seen as a mark of suspicion. It was easier not to ask questions. It was easier not to open the door to things better left closed. But after that night, the night she was shot in cold blood right in front of him, everything changed. Marcus's grief was raw, burning through him like a fever. The loss of his mother, the shock of her death, threatened to crush him, but it was the unanswered questions, the sudden realization that there was so much more to her than he had ever known, that gnawed at him the most. He didn't even have to search for long. In the days after her funeral, when the world outside seemed to blur in a haze of anger and sorrow, Marcus found the first clue. It was tucked away in an old leather journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. He had seen it 1,000 times, never thinking to open it. But now, as his hands trembled with the weight of grief, he lifted the journal and began to read. The pages were filled with military codes, maps, and names of places he didn't recognize. His heart pounded in his chest as he read about operations, covert missions, and strategy, things no mother should have to deal with, let alone one who had raised him in the quiet town of Fair Creek. Then came the photographs, black and white images of a woman he didn't know, a younger, more hardened version of Evelyn. She was in uniform, standing tall beside soldiers, guns slung over their shoulders, eyes steely with determination. The pictures weren't from her time in civilian life. They were from another life, another world entirely, a world he knew nothing about. The words Delta Force stood out on a crumpled piece of paper, scribbled hurriedly, as if written in a moment of panic. Marcus stopped. His breath caught in his throat as the truth began to settle in. His mother had been a part of something far darker than he had ever imagined. She had been a commander in the most elite, most secretive unit of the United States military, and she wasn't just any commander. She had been one of the deadliest, a woman who had led missions that no one would ever speak of, a woman who had taken lives to protect her country, a woman who had buried parts of herself so deep that no one, least of all her son, would ever find them. But now, it was too late to ask her about it. Now, the only thing left was revenge, and in order to understand the true depth of the system that had taken her life, Marcus had to walk in her footsteps. He had to become what she had once been. He had to uncover the dark world she had left behind. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Have you experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more of our stories. Now, let's continue. The evening had been quiet, almost too quiet. Marcus had finished his homework and helped his mother prepare dinner. as the delicious smells of collard greens and cornbread filled the small house. The comforting sounds of Evelyn humming in the kitchen brought a sense of normalcy to an otherwise unsettling day. The grief that still clung to him was a dull ache now, a low hum in the background of his life. It wasn't gone, but it had been manageable. But that peace was about to be shattered. It had been one of those nights when Marcus had promised himself he would keep his head down. Nothing was going to disrupt the fragile calm he had managed to build. The store wasn't far, just a quick walk down the road, and he needed a few things. Snacks for later, a drink for his mother. He didn't think anything of it as he slipped out of the house, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The store was small, tucked between two larger buildings, and run by a family that had been in Fair Creek for generations. Marcus had been there 100 times. The place was familiar, safe even, or so he thought. He stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming as he entered. The store smelled of old wood and stale air, the faint scent of fruit rotting in the corner. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, but also where everyone had their opinions about you, whether you were black or white, rich or poor. And today, it seemed, those opinions were about to matter far more than they ever had before. Marcus made his way to the snack aisle, grabbing a bag of chips and a soda. As he approached the counter, the door opened, and two police officers walked in. One was Officer Jones, the same officer who had pulled him over 2 months ago for no reason at all, giving him that same look of judgment. The other was Officer Harris, his younger, more eager partner, the kind who wanted to prove himself in the eyes of his colleagues. "Hey, boy," Officer Jones said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You paying for those?" Marcus froze. He'd been in the store countless times before, and the question had never come up. He turned to face the officer, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm paying," Marcus replied, holding up the receipt for the snacks. But that wasn't enough. Officer Jones narrowed his eyes, his stance shifting as he took a step closer. "You sure about that? You're not trying to steal from me, are you?" His voice was loud now, the insinuation clear for everyone in the store to hear. The people around them had stopped what they were doing, their eyes turning toward the scene unfolding. Marcus felt his heart race, his palms sweating. He had seen this before, felt it, the racial tension that seemed to hang in the air, the way people like him were always questioned, always assumed to be guilty. "I'm not stealing anything," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "I just want to buy my stuff." Officer Harris, standing behind Officer Jones, seemed to hesitate for a moment, but that hesitation didn't last long. His eyes darted between Marcus and his partner, and without warning, he stepped forward, grabbing Marcus's arm roughly. "Let's go outside, kid," Officer Harris said, his tone laced with authority. "You're causing a scene." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He knew the routine. He'd seen it happen to others in the town, to people who looked like him. This wasn't just an arrest. This was something else. It was a power play, a way of putting him in his place. And suddenly, he felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't just some kid getting into trouble. He was a black man in a small town, and that made him a target. "Let go of me," Marcus shouted, pulling his arm away. But it was too late. Officer Harris's grip tightened, and he shoved Marcus toward the door. The store's customers looked on, some with quiet expressions, others with barely hidden disdain. No one stepped forward to help. No one said a word. And that's when Evelyn arrived. She had been just down the street, heading back from the bakery when she saw the commotion through the window. She recognized Marcus immediately. He was her son, after all, and her heart sank as she saw the officers manhandling him. Without thinking, she hurried toward the store, her pulse quickening. As she entered, her voice was calm but unwavering. "What's going on here?" she asked, standing tall between the officers and her son. Officer Jones turned, his face twisting into a sneer. "This boy's been causing trouble, ma'am. We're just making sure he's not up to no good." Evelyn's eyes flicked to Marcus's face. He was terrified, but trying to stay composed. Her heart clenched at the sight. She wasn't just seeing her son, she was seeing all the black boys who had been mistreated, who had been accused without reason, who had been thrown into the system for nothing more than the color of their skin. "Let him go," she said firmly. "He hasn't done anything wrong." The officers exchanged a glance. There was an uncomfortable pause as they weighed their options. But then, as if they had decided they were in control, Officer Jones took a step forward, his hand going to his holster. "Ma'am," he said, his voice lowering with a cold edge, "you need to move along. Now." Evelyn stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere until you let him go." For a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, and then, without warning, The sound of a gunshot rang out, shattering the fragile peace of that moment. Evelyn crumpled to the floor, a dark stain spreading beneath her body. The world stood still. Evelyn's body lay in the middle of the small store, blood pooling around her like a river of lost hope. The air, once thick with tension, now carried the sharp scent of gunpowder and the heavy silence that followed the shot. The customers stood frozen in place, their faces pale and eyes wide, but none of them dared to move. The officers didn't either. They stood there, momentarily stunned, unsure of what to do next. Marcus's heart slammed against his ribs, his entire body shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming rush of emotions coursing through him. Disbelief, rage, despair, all at once. His mother, the woman who had shielded him from the world's cruelest realities, was now lying lifeless on the floor, and those officers, had taken her life. His world had just collapsed. There were no words, no thoughts, only the raw, unfiltered need to do something, anything, to make them pay. His first instinct was to rush to her side, to cradle her in his arms and scream, but he couldn't. His legs wouldn't move. His body refused to listen to his mind. And then, a whisper, a voice deep inside him, cut through the shock. You can't just let this go. You know what she did for this country. You know who she was. You know what she could have been. In that instant, Marcus knew what he had to do. His eyes locked on the officers, and he felt a surge of power, the same power that his mother had once commanded, the power that had kept her alive in a world full of enemies. She had fought so many battles, not just for her country, but for the people she loved. And now, it was his turn to fight, his turn to make them understand the price they had forced him to pay. But how? How could he avenge her without becoming the thing he hated the most? How could he walk that line between justice and revenge? His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of the door slamming open. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, their features barely visible in the dim light of the store, but Marcus knew immediately who it was. It was Mike, his old friend. Mike had been like a brother to Marcus, always there when he needed him. They'd shared the same experiences, grown up in the same rough neighborhoods, and had always had each other's backs. But now, Mike's face was full of disbelief and fear as he took in the scene before him. What the hell happened? Mike's voice trembled, his eyes darting from Evelyn's lifeless form to the officers who were still standing in shock. Marcus didn't respond right away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His jaw was tight, his teeth grinding together. He wanted to scream. He wanted to shout at the injustice of it all. But instead, he stood there, unable to find the words. Marcus, we need to get out of here, Mike said, his voice growing urgent. You can't do this. You'll get yourself killed. Marcus finally turned to face him, his eyes burning with a cold fury. I'm not leaving her here, he said through gritted teeth. I'm not going to let them get away with this. Mike's face twisted in anguish. You don't know what you're getting into. This isn't just about them. This is bigger. You're talking about the system. You're talking about people who have power over life and death. You think just because you're angry, it's going to be enough? Marcus's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. He had never felt this level of rage before. His mother had taught him to be strong, to hold his head high in the face of adversity. But this was something different. This was personal. This was a war he didn't know how to fight, but he had to. I don't care, he said. I'll make them pay for what they did to her. Mike looked around, his gaze lingering on the officers. This is insane. You're asking for a death sentence, Marcus. I don't care, Marcus repeated, his voice steady now. I'll make them regret the day they ever put a hand on my mother. There was a moment of silence as Mike stared at him, as though trying to read him. Finally, he nodded, slowly, resignedly. All right, but you need to be smart about this. We can't just rush in guns blazing. We need to plan. We need to be strategic. Marcus's mind was already racing. The plan was taking shape, piece by piece, like a puzzle slowly coming together. He knew the police officers wouldn't be the only ones involved in this. The corruption ran deeper. They were part of something bigger, something that could not be taken down by brute force alone. This would take strategy, intelligence, and precision. He didn't have the training his mother had, but he had something just as important, the will to fight for her, for justice. The next few moments passed in a blur. Marcus and Mike exchanged hurried words, making a plan, mapping out the next steps. But even as they spoke, Marcus's mind was already preparing for what would come next. He knew he couldn't let this moment pass. He couldn't let the system that had taken his mother's life continue to operate unchecked. And so, with a fire burning in his chest, he made a vow to bring down the corrupt, to take back the power that had been stolen from him, to make them feel the pain they had inflicted on his family. The officers, still standing frozen, finally seemed to come to their senses, but it was too late. Marcus had already made his decision. The days following Evelyn's death passed in a blur for Marcus. Each one felt like a lifetime, a slow and painful march toward a destination he couldn't fully comprehend. He kept his head down, avoided the press, and stayed out of sight. The entire town was buzzing with rumors, half of them speculating that the officers had acted out of fear, the other half claiming that the shooting was an accident. But Marcus knew better. The world around him seemed to pulse with a steady, cold indifference, as if nothing had changed. His mother was dead, and they were already moving on. But Marcus couldn't move on. He spent hours alone in his apartment, pacing, staring at the wall, replaying every moment of that day over and over again in his head. The image of his mother crumpling to the floor, blood spilling from her chest, was burned into his mind like a brand. It was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But more than that, it was a fire that burned within him, driving him toward something he hadn't fully understood yet. One thing was clear, he had no choice but to act. He couldn't let her death be in vain. She had been a force of nature, a woman who had fought in ways most couldn't even fathom. He wasn't going to let the system that took her from him win. Not this time. And so, he began to plan. His first step was to visit the one place he never thought he would go again, the police station. It was a bold move, and one that could easily end with him in handcuffs or worse. But he needed information. There was something he had to know before he could move forward with his revenge, the truth. Marcus's eyes burned with determination as he walked through the front doors of the station. His heart was hammering in his chest, each beat a reminder of why he was there. The officers behind the front desk barely acknowledged him as he approached. The place was as sterile and cold as he remembered, with the same oppressive, institutional smell. It felt like a graveyard for broken promises, where the cries of the helpless were lost in the echoes of bureaucracy. But he couldn't let that scare him. He was here for one reason only, to find the weakness, to find the crack in the system. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "I need to speak with Captain Miller." The officer behind the desk glanced up at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "You sure about that? Captain's a busy man." "I'm sure," Marcus replied, not breaking his gaze. "Tell him it's about the incident at the store." The officer hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone and dialed. Marcus could hear the faint sound of the conversation on the other end of the line, but he couldn't make out the words. He wasn't concerned. He knew this was a gamble, but it was the only move he had. A few moments later, the officer put down the phone and gestured for Marcus to follow him. They walked down a narrow hallway that smelled of old coffee and stale air, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Marcus's every step felt like it echoed through the building. His mind raced with questions, but he kept them locked away for now. He had to focus. When they reached the captain's office, the officer knocked and then opened the door. Inside, Captain Miller was sitting at his desk, flipping through a stack of papers. He didn't look up as they entered. "Marcus," Captain Miller said, his voice a mix of surprise and cold professionalism. "What brings you here?" Marcus stood tall, his posture straight and unyielding. He wasn't there to beg for answers. He wasn't there to plead. He was there to set the stage for what was to come. "I'm here to get the truth," Marcus said, his voice firm, but his insides were roiling. "I want to know why my mother had to die." Captain Miller finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. The tension in the room thickened. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, the captain seemed to hesitate. Marcus could see the calculation behind those cold, steely eyes, the awareness that this was no ordinary visit. "She died because of a mistake," Miller said, his voice clipped, his tone defensive. "A tragic accident, that's all it was." Marcus felt his blood boil. He took a step closer to the desk, leaning forward. "Don't lie to me," he spat. "You know what happened. You know exactly what happened, and I'm not leaving here until you tell me the truth." Miller's eyes flashed with irritation, but he kept his composure. "You're asking for trouble, Marcus. You need to leave before this gets worse for you." Marcus didn't back down. He couldn't, not now. "I'm not leaving," he said again. "I want to know who made the call. Who told your officers that my mother was a threat?" The room went silent. For a moment, Miller just stared at him. Then, he sighed deeply, as if weighing his options. "Do you really want to know?" he asked, his voice suddenly quieter, almost as if he was considering Marcus's question for the first time. "Because once you do, there's no going back." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "I want to know." Miller leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the window. "You're right. It wasn't an accident. Your mother wasn't just some woman in a store. He hesitated. She was someone who had made enemies, and when the wrong people found out who she was, things changed. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Who? Miller looked back at him, his expression colder now. That's not something you're ready to hear. Marcus stood there, stunned, but something in him, a feeling deep within his gut, told him it wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Miller's admission that Evelyn had made enemies was enough to shatter the fragile veneer of normalcy Marcus had been holding onto. He could feel the blood drain from his face as the implications of what the captain had said began to settle in. His mother had always been a woman of mystery, but now it was clear that there was more to her than he had ever known. Who? Marcus repeated, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. Who were these people? Miller didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring out the window, the harsh light of the afternoon casting shadows across his face. It was as if he was searching for the right words, or perhaps deciding how much he could reveal without jeopardizing himself. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Miller spoke, his voice soft but tinged with something close to regret. You don't want to know, Marcus. There are things you're better off not understanding. The people involved, they have power, real power, and they won't hesitate to make you disappear if you go too far. Marcus's mind was racing. Power? People who could make him disappear. The implications were far more dangerous than anything he had anticipated, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. His mother had paid the ultimate price, and now he was being asked to back down, to walk away from the very truth that would set the world right. Who? Marcus asked again, this time with more force. Tell me, Captain. Miller let out a long breath, clearly weighing his options. The people who were behind this, they're higher up the food chain than the officers you're blaming. They're part of something much bigger, something that's been in place for years. This isn't just about one officer's mistake. This is about corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement. People who think they're untouchable. Marcus's heart pounded as the pieces started to fall into place. Corruption, power, untouchable. It was like a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. And now, finally, he was beginning to see the edges, the outline of something far more sinister than he had ever imagined. They're the ones who orchestrated the whole thing, Miller continued, his voice growing heavier with each word. Your mother got in their way, and when they found out who she really was, they made sure she didn't live to tell anyone else. They used the officers as pawns, told them she was a threat, a danger, all a lie. But the damage was done, and now they have control over everything. Marcus felt a cold fury rise within him, his hands clenched into fists, the muscles in his arms tight with the need for action. This wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. It was about something much larger, something that had its roots deep in the corrupt foundation of the system that had taken his mother's life. He knew he couldn't stop now. He had to tear this whole system down. What do I need to do? Marcus asked, his voice now low and dangerous. Who do I need to go after? Miller's eyes flickered to him, a hint of something almost like fear in his gaze. You don't know what you're asking, Marcus. You think you can take on the whole system? You're just one man. You'll be crushed. Marcus didn't flinch. I'm not asking for permission, Captain. I'm asking for information. Who do I go after next? Miller stared at him for a long moment, and then, as if finally accepting that Marcus wouldn't back down, he sighed and stood up. He walked to a filing cabinet at the far side of the room, opened a drawer, and pulled out a manila folder. This is all I can give you, Miller said, tossing the folder onto the desk. Inside are names, addresses, contacts, the people who made your mother's death happen. But be careful, they won't just sit back and let you come for them. They'll come for you first. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed the folder, feeling the weight of it in his hands. This was it, the beginning of the end. Thanks, he said, his voice low. I'll take it from here. Miller gave him a nod, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold acknowledgement of what had just transpired. As Marcus turned and walked out of the room, the reality of what he was about to do hit him hard. He was stepping into a world that he had never known, a world where the rules didn't apply, and where power came at the cost of everything. But there was no turning back now. He had to make them pay. The night air was thick with tension as Marcus drove through the deserted streets of the city. His hands gripped the wheel with a steady, unshakable determination. His mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once, but all of them led to one singular purpose: justice. His mother's death was no longer just a personal loss. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system, everything rotten in the world he had once trusted. He glanced down at the folder that lay on the passenger seat, the one Miller had given him. It was sealed shut, but he knew what was inside: names, addresses, connections, a road map to the people who had orchestrated the death of the only person who had ever cared for him. Each name was a target, each address a place where he could bring the storm that had been building in him since the moment his mother's life was taken. He had no illusions about what he was doing. This wasn't just a revenge mission, it was a declaration of war. The people who had killed Evelyn didn't just kill her because of who she was, they killed her because of what she represented. She had been a symbol of defiance, someone who refused to bow to the powers that had corrupted every institution they touched. They had tried to silence her, but they had only made a martyr of her. Now, it was his turn to finish what she had started. He had no plan to stop until every single one of them was brought to justice. Marcus knew that once he crossed this line, there would be no going back. He was already a marked man. The system would hunt him down, and everyone he loved would be at risk. But he didn't care. He couldn't care. His mother's life had been taken, and for that, there was no price too high. He pulled up to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the address that had been scribbled at the top of one of the pages in the folder. The place looked abandoned, but Marcus knew better than to trust appearances. The people who were involved in this were smart, and they had eyes everywhere. It was a trap, but it was a trap he was more than ready for. As he stepped out of the car, he felt the weight of the night settle in. The air was cold against his skin, a chill that cut through him like a reminder of the stakes. This wasn't about just taking down corrupt officers or untouchable politicians. This was about taking down the entire system. It was about breaking the chains that had kept people like him and his mother in subjugation for so long. The sound of his boots hitting the pavement echoed in the silence, each step taking him closer to whatever awaited him inside that warehouse. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no fear in him, only a seething determination. Every step, every movement, was deliberate, a calculated effort to show that he was no longer afraid. He reached the door and paused for a moment, his hand resting on the cold metal. The adrenaline coursed through his veins, his mind sharp with focus. He could hear the faint sounds of movement inside, voices, footsteps. It was a trap, but Marcus wasn't concerned. He had spent his life preparing for moments like this, learning to strike when the odds were stacked against him. With a swift movement, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The moment Marcus stepped into the warehouse, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick, humid, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. The dim light from a single hanging bulb cast long shadows, and the smell of rust and old machinery filled his nostrils. The faint echoes of voices stopped the instant he crossed the threshold, as if the people inside were aware of his presence. For a brief moment, he stood there, his eyes scanning the interior. The warehouse was vast, filled with rows of metal crates and machinery that seemed to have been abandoned long ago. In the distance, a few figures were moving, but they had not yet seen him. Marcus didn't flinch. He knew exactly what he was walking into. The people who had killed his mother didn't just send a couple of officers to do the job. They had orchestrated an entire operation, a web of manipulation that reached far and wide. This wasn't going to be a quick hit. This was going to be a war. He moved silently, his body honed and trained for moments like this. Every step was calculated, every breath measured. His senses were sharp. He could hear every footstep, every movement around him. He knew they were watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. But he was ready. In the center of the warehouse, he saw them, 3 men, standing in a circle, their backs to him. They were talking in hushed tones, unaware of Marcus's presence. The faint glint of metal from a gun holster caught his eye, and his heart quickened. These men were just the beginning. They were pawns, just like the officers who had killed his mother. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and then moved. The first man didn't hear him coming. Marcus's hand moved like lightning, grabbing the man's shoulder and spinning him around. Before the man could react, Marcus's fist landed with brutal precision, smashing into his face with the force of a sledgehammer. The man crumpled instantly, his body falling to the ground with a dull thud. The other 2 turned, their eyes wide with shock, but Marcus was already on them. He moved with the fluidity of a predator, his body a weapon honed by years of training. The second man lunged at him, swinging wildly with a pipe, but Marcus sidestepped the attack with ease, ducking low and sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The man hit the ground with a sickening thud, his head bouncing off the concrete floor. The third man reached for his gun, but Marcus was faster. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it, forcing the gun to fall to the ground. A knee to the gut sent the man reeling, and before he could recover, Marcus delivered a crushing blow to his jaw, knocking him unconscious. In a matter of seconds, Marcus had incapacitated all 3 men. His heart was racing, But there was no time to revel in the success. He had to keep moving. The next wave was coming, and he had no intention of letting up. As he moved deeper into the warehouse, the silence was broken by a loud bang, a door slamming open. Marcus's instincts kicked in immediately. He dove for cover, just as a barrage of bullets ripped through the air. He could hear the men shouting, their footsteps echoing as they rushed to encircle him. They knew he was here now, and they were coming for him. But Marcus was ready. He peeked out from behind a stack of crates, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. He counted at least 6 men approaching, all armed. They were professionals, mercenaries by the look of it, and they had been trained for moments like this. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He had been trained to survive against impossible odds. The first man came into view, his gun raised. Marcus's reflexes were faster. He slid out from his cover, moving like a shadow, and before the man could even register his presence, Marcus slammed into him with the force of a freight train. The man was thrown to the ground, and Marcus quickly retrieved his weapon, a sleek, silenced pistol that he had grabbed from one of the unconscious men. He didn't hesitate. 2 shots rang out, the sound muffled by the silencer. The first man dropped, a bullet to the head. The second man didn't even have time to react before he was met with the same fate. Marcus moved like a storm, a blur of motion as he took down each man with deadly precision. The warehouse was his battleground now, and he was the hunter. There was no room for mercy. He wasn't just fighting for revenge, he was fighting for the truth, for the justice his mother had never received. As the last of the mercenaries fell, Marcus stood in the center of the chaos, his breath heavy, his body covered in sweat. The warehouse was silent now, save for the distant hum of the machines. It was over for now. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. There was still much more to be done. These men were only a small part of the web of corruption he was about to tear apart. He wasn't going to stop until every single one of them paid for what they had done to his mother. Marcus moved through the shadows, his senses heightened, his pulse steady. The warehouse was behind him now, and he was back on the streets, navigating the labyrinth of alleyways and back roads that had once been familiar to him. But nothing was familiar anymore. The city felt like a different world, one where the rules had changed, and nothing could be trusted. He had taken down the mercenaries with ease, but he knew that the battle was far from over. Those men were just pawns, mere distractions to keep him occupied while the true masterminds remained in the shadows. He had learned enough from the files Miller had given him to know that there was still one last player to confront. A person so deeply embedded in the system that even the most powerful men in the city didn't know the full extent of their influence. It was time to take the fight to the heart of the beast. Marcus had always known there was more to his mother's death than what met the eye. It hadn't been a random act of violence, it had been orchestrated, carefully planned. Every move, every detail had been designed to send a message. They hadn't just killed Evelyn to silence her, they had done it to destroy everything she had built, to erase her legacy. She had been a thorn in their side for years, a symbol of resistance to a system that thrived on corruption, greed, and control. And now, it was time for Marcus to finish what she had started. But to do that, he needed to find the one who had pulled the strings from behind the scenes. The last lead had taken him to a secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind tall gates and a forest of overgrown trees. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to remain unseen. Someone who had the wealth and the power to make people disappear without a trace. This was where he would find the answers he was searching for, the last thread that would unravel the entire conspiracy. As Marcus approached the gates, he paused, his eyes scanning the area. He knew better than to walk in blindly. The place was heavily guarded, and for good reason. This mansion wasn't just a residence, it was the nerve center of a vast criminal empire, and whoever lived here had access to every secret in the city. But Marcus was prepared. He crouched low, moving like a ghost through the underbrush, his body a blur of motion as he made his way to the side of the mansion. His training had taught him how to move without being detected, how to read the environment and use it to his advantage. He knew where the blind spots were, where the guards were likely to be stationed. He was a predator in a world of prey, and he was about to make his move. The back door to the mansion was unlocked. Just as he had suspected, Marcus slipped inside, his footsteps silent on the marble floors. He was in. The mansion was grand, its walls lined with paintings and sculptures, a testament to the wealth and power of its owner. But it felt cold, sterile, like a place where people lived but never truly existed. It was the kind of place where everything had been carefully curated to create an illusion of perfection, where the inhabitants were nothing more than actors playing a role in a game they could never escape. Marcus moved through the halls, his mind focused, his eyes alert. He could feel the presence of someone in the house. He wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Growing closer, Marcus pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow, waiting for the right moment. And then, there he was. A man in a tailored suit, his face cold and expressionless, stepped into the hallway. He didn't see Marcus. He walked with the air of someone who had never known a day of struggle in his life. A man who had everything and took it for granted. He was a puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, his power so vast that he believed he was untouchable. Marcus's hand tightened around the grip of his gun. This was it. This was the man who had caused everything, the man who had ordered his mother's death. But Marcus didn't move. He watched him for a moment longer, the fury inside him growing like a storm. He wanted to rush forward, to take him down right then and there. But that would be too easy. He needed answers. He needed to understand just how deep the rot went. He had to make this count. As the man walked past him, Marcus stepped out of the shadows, moving with the precision of a trained assassin. His footfalls were quiet, his body fluid, like water slipping through cracks. He reached the man in seconds, grabbing him by the arm and spinning him around. The man's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening to shout, but Marcus's hand was already on his throat, squeezing just enough to silence him. "I know what you did." Marcus's voice was low, cold, a knife edged with the weight of his mother's death, "and I'm here to make you pay." The man's eyes darted around, panic setting in as he realized he was no longer in control. His power, his wealth, all the walls he had built around himself, none of it mattered now. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the man gasped, his voice trembling. Marcus smiled darkly, tightening his grip just a little more. "Oh, I think I do." The man's face turned pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. He was a predator now facing the consequences of his own actions. And Marcus, for the first time since this all began, allowed himself to feel something other than rage. It was satisfaction, the satisfaction of knowing that the person who had taken his mother's life was finally at his mercy. But Marcus didn't kill him right away. He had questions, too many questions that needed answering. He dragged the man toward a nearby room, where a large desk sat in the center, papers and files scattered across it. There were phones, laptops, everything a man needed to stay in control. It was here, in this room, that Marcus would get the answers he had been searching for. He threw the man into the chair, his grip tightening again as he pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Talk," Marcus demanded, his voice low but firm. "Tell me everything." Marcus sat across from the man, the tension in the air so thick it was almost tangible. The man was shaking now, fear coursing through him as his world crumbled around him. He could feel his grip tightening, but he knew better than to give in to the overwhelming urge for vengeance. He had come this far, and now, more than ever, he needed answers. The man, who had once seemed so untouchable, so powerful, was now a mere shell of his former self. He was nothing but a scared, trembling wreck, and Marcus could almost taste the fear in the air. He had broken the walls of this man's empire, had cracked the veneer of invincibility he had worn for so long. It was only a matter of time before the truth came pouring out. "You think you can just walk away from all of this?" Marcus's voice was a razor-sharp whisper. "You think you can kill my mother and keep running?" The man coughed, his eyes darting around the room, desperate for an escape that didn't exist. His mind was racing, the thoughts spinning like a tornado inside his head. But Marcus wasn't going to let him hide anymore, not after everything. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," the man stammered, his voice weak. "It was never supposed to be like this. Your mother was a threat to everything we were building. You don't understand, we had to make an example of her." Marcus leaned in, his face inches from the man's. "An example?" he repeated, his voice low but deadly. "An example for who?" The man's eyes widened, his breath quickening as he finally realized the inevitable. There was no way out. Marcus had him cornered, and he had nowhere to hide. "We were building an empire," the man admitted, his voice breaking. "A system that would give us control over everything, over the government, the police, the businesses. Your mother was standing in our way. She was too powerful, too smart. She couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, and she knew too much." The words hung in the air, a brutal confession that made Marcus's blood boil. His mother had been a force of nature, a woman who had fought against corruption with everything she had, and in the end, they had silenced her, hoping to crush her spirit and erase her legacy. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Who else?" Marcus demanded, his voice barely a growl now. "Who else is involved? Tell me everything." The man hesitated, his face pale, sweat dripping down his brow. He knew that this was his last chance, his last moment to save himself. And yet, even as he hesitated, He knew there was no redemption. There was no escape. The government, the man whispered, his voice trembling. The police, even some of the highest people in the city, they were all in on it. We had connections everywhere. Your mother's murder was just the beginning. It's bigger than you think, Marcus. The words cut through him like a knife, and for a moment, Marcus felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was worse than he had imagined. The conspiracy was deeper than he could have ever known. And yet, Marcus remained calm. His hands didn't shake. His resolve was steel. I'm going to take everything from you, Marcus said coldly. But first, you'll see how deep the roots of your empire really go. The man's eyes filled with terror. He knew that Marcus wasn't just talking about his wealth, his power. He was talking about everything, about the vast network of corruption, the people who had betrayed him, and the entire system that had fed on others' suffering. In that moment, Marcus understood the scale of the battle he was about to wage. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice. It was about taking down a system that had crushed the life out of countless people, all in the name of greed and power. Without another word, Marcus rose from his seat. His task wasn't finished. It was only just beginning. He left the mansion with a quiet determination, the weight of his mother's memory pressing him forward. He knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the final step in a much larger journey, a journey that would see him bring down the entire criminal empire, piece by piece, until nothing was left but the truth. As he disappeared into the night, Marcus knew that his mother's spirit would guide him. Her fight had been his fight, and now, it was his turn to finish it. The war was on.